Rent with free land. Under these conditions, there is a certain amount of land which may be had for nothing. Of this land, some is cultivated which pays no rent, other is not cultivated at all. Why then will land bear rent under such circumstances? Obviously because it is more desirable than the land which may be had for nothing. How much rent will it bear? Just as much as it is more desirable. Suppose figure 4 represent the land of country, foreign land being excluded from competition for sake of our illustration, arranged in 7 groups according to desirability. The first group, deduction made of enough of the product to pay transportation on the crop, will raise and send to market 28 bushels of wheat per acre. The second 24, the others 20, 16, 12, and 8, and 4 respectively. Now if the people are few and need but a small part of the land, they will naturally cultivate or the land which best combines fertility and accessibility. So long as there is enough of this land, there cannot well be any rent, for a man will not pay rent for what he can get for nothing. But the time comes when more land is needed and cultivation must begin in Group B. Land is still free there, but all of Group A is taken. If now a man insists upon cultivating land in Group A, he must pay for the privilege, for the owner will not consent to move off onto poorer land unless he can maintain his advantage. How much is this advantage? Question. 4 bushels per acre, for labor alone working upon free land can produce only 24 bushels. The land in B, which is free, is now the margin of cultivation, that is the grade of the land which will pay for cultivation and no more. The natural reward of labor is agriculture, its total return to cultivation of the margin of cultivation. After deductions are made on the account of the returns to capital and its replacement, this advantage which the owners of A land now have over the tillers of the free land, whether they let the land or not, is rent. The amount per acre at this point will the market piece of 4 bushels of wheat. With the development of population, more land is needed. The margin of cultivation descends to C, land. The reward is simple labor is diminished, and rent increases. B land now pays a rent of 4 bushels, and A land a rent of 8. It is of course hardly need to be said that there is much such gradation of land as represented in Figure 4. The real vibration would be nearly represented like Figure 5. If we consider city lots, also the extremes of value would be immensely greater that there here is represented. Those facts, however, do not alter the principle. Rent with and without free land. Bushels per acre. When the margin of cultivation is extended to E on B land equal 1/2 of the A land, 4/7 of the entire product, it is clear that at this point of the productivity of groups E, F, and G may be had for the taking. A moment's reflection will show the portion of productivity of the other groups may also be had free. Rent with no free land, continuing the descent of the margin of cultivation down from E to F and G. We can easily imagine a time when all the land should be called for and no free land would be left. Following the law already explained, rent would absorb more and more of the product until the disappearance of free land. The entire product would not be consumed as rent. This is of course possible if the owners of the land cultivate it with their own hands. In this case, rent is indistinguishable from return to labor, the only difference being that the owners of the best land are better rewarded than the others. But this direct cultivation of its owners is far from general. Long before land is wholly taken up in any country, a great deal of it's held by men who do not cultivate it with their hands but lease it to others. In this case, the owner of the landlord appropriates the rent, leaving the free productivity to the tenant as the reward of his labor. As rent increases, the margin of free productivity decreases. But there is clearly a limit to this, for tenants cannot work for nothing and turn all product over to the landlord. Rent may pass down the scale, say, to E or possibly F, but it must stop at the point where the tenant will have enough to live. Thus, it is even in countries which long ago had need for all their land bears little or no rent. Under existing methods of cultivation, a man cannot pay rent for it and live off its produce. We may thus picture to ourselves the law of the rent as advancing force which slowly but surely carries everything before it until it is met by the law of wages, which checks and finally arrests its progress. This arrest of progress, of course, there must be at least a minimum return to capital, but that here is neglected as far as a minor factor. Of rent practically means that the poorest land which will not pay rent or repay cultivation is not nominally appropriated for other than the purposes of production. Intense cultivation. Returning to our figure, let us place ourselves again at the point all the A land is taken and new members of society are looking for more land. We have assumed that they will take up land in the second group. That is not necessary. However, more labor may be put on the land already cultivated and more will be raised. Suppose that 10 men cultivate 100 acres of A land, raising 2,800 bushels of wheat. But the numbers increase, and to each group one more is added. As the cultivation was, of course, imperfect, additional labor increases the crop. The 11 men raise 3,060 bushels. That is, the 11th man has raised 260 bushels, not so as much as the others raised, but 20 bushels more than he could have raised on B land. Of course, the owner gives him only as much as he could get elsewhere and secures an additional rent of 20 bushels. Encouraged by this, he hires the 12th man and secures a crop of 3,280 bushels. The 2 extra men have raised 480 bushels by their labor, but this is just what the landowner had to pay for them and their labor. He therefore finds that while one additional man increases his rent, 2 do not, and discharges the second, who takes up free land. Thus, as numbers increase, a part of the increase aids the intensifying the cultivation of the old land, while another part takes up new land. With each fall in the margin of cultivation, more labor may be profitably employed on a land already cultivated. Thus, our landowner who could not afford to employ 12 man at 240 bushels wage can employ a 13th or possibly more when they return to the labor falls to 200 bushels. Each addition of labor or capital in the cultivation of land increases the return, but not in the same proportion. This is the law of distinguishing returns, one of the most stern, visaged laws in economics, which indicates that other things being equal, each addition to the number of human beings on earth beyond a certain number at least makes harder the process. Rent without free land. By which man draws his sustenance from the earth before the certain number is reached of the law of diminishing returns, does not begin to operate, but one of the increasing returns obtains. We may suppose that up to the 10th man in the example given, every man added more than the previous to the product as a certain number of men needed for the most effective organization of production. The law of increasing and diminishing returns would be represented by a diagram somewhat like figure 6. The enclosed areas represent returns to each unit of the productive energy. At E, the maximum is reached and the law of diminishing returns begins to operate. As we shall see, however, other things are not equal, and this law is partially concentrated by another. It is to be noticed that the power of the rent to make laborers work for an even smaller return is due, not chiefly to nature, but rather to institution of private property. So great has the hardship of rent seemed to some that it has been proposed that society should appropriate rents through the mechanism of government, or what amounts to the same thing, the private ownership of land should be abolished, the proposition we shall consider later. All improvements in the methods of agriculture increase the product, then they increase the cost. The population can thus live on less land, and poorer land is thrown out of cultivation as day to day in our New England states. Thus the margin of cultivation is raised and rent decreases. As a matter of fact, However, in old countries, this is a temporary result. The population is sure to increase, and this usually at so rapid rates that they seem to pace with improvements. Not only does the margin of cultivation not rise, but it may actually fall, because with better knowledge and methods, poor land will repay cultivation, and the additional cultivators are sure to be forthcoming when land is all taken. Rent, as we have seen, is limited by the law of wages only. And if its improvement here is less in methods of cultivation, then often been the case that the landowner may not only have larger product, but a larger percentage of the product. If we are dealing with the law, rent is isolated force, the tendency improvements in land cultivation would undoubtedly be to decrease rent. But considering society as it is, tendency may be the reverse. All development of production subsequent to agriculture, by which raw materials receive an increasingly large amount of labor, tends to improve the lot of labor. Rent and the value of price. Rent has no influence whatever on the value of products, although a large part of this value goes to the landowner. This will be clear when we recall the nature of value already explained. Value is due to unsatisfied wants or desires. It is human desires which become more numerous and more clamorous, force cultivation down to poorer and poorer lands. If men do not want to sufficiently give a man for 12 bushels of it as much as to satisfy his wants as he could get in the same time, in some other way he will not cultivate the 12 bushel land. If they do, he will. Thus, the extent of cultivation measures the strength of human desire in this line and determines value. When desire makes wheat valuable enough to pay for cultivating the poor land, it will be cultivated. Not before, but it is desire, not the cultivation, which gives wheat its value. The fact that some land produces wheat easily and pays a large rent to its owner has no effect on value. Men cannot be expected to sell wheat below the price fixed by human desires, just because they got it easily, and if the land, and they did, the millers would simply add the difference to their profits. The abolition of rent payment and the appropriation of rent by the public instead of by the private persons might have a great influence on the economic life of society, but it would not have any direct influence in lowering the price of agricultural products. Rent with free land, without free land. Summary. Number 1, rent is the portion of the product of land which is in the access of the product of the most poorest land under cultivation. 2, as long as good land exists in excess, all demand free land, quote, rent is determined by the excess of product over that of the best free land. 3, when land is all taken and all cultivated, which will repay the cost, rent is determined by the excess of product over the necessities of laborers as determined by the law of wages. 4, increased demand of products of the soil may result in cultivation of more land, extensive cultivation, or in the application of more labor and capital that already in cultivation, intense cultivation. 5, each addition of labor or capital in the cultivation of land beyond a certain point increases the return, but not in the same proportion. The law of diminishing returns. 6, improvements in agriculture with free land and stationary population would decrease rent, but in old countries and with an increasing population, the opposite result may take place. 7, value and price are not affected by rent. Questions. Number 1, on what is rent based? Always pause for questions. If all land were equally good, would it bear rent while free land existed? Why? Spit. 2, how is the amount of rent determined while free land exists? How is the reward of labor determined? 3, what limits rent when land is all taken? What then would rent be if the law of rent operated unchecked? What is meant by intensive cultivation? What determines how far it will pay? What is the law of diminishing returns? 5, what is the margin of cultivation? What effect does a lowering of the margin of cultivation have upon intensivity of cultivation. Why? 6. What is the effect improvements in cultivation so far as the law of rent alone is concerned? What is the